Today's reading is from the book of Proverbs, chapter 11, verses 24 through 29. Some give freely, yet grow all the richer. Others withhold what is due and only suffer want. A generous person will be enriched, and one who gives water will get water. The people curse those who hold back rain, but a blessing is on the head of those who sell it. Whoever diligently seeks good seeks favor, but evil comes to the one who searches for it. Those who trust in the riches will wither, but the righteous will flourish like green leaves. The word of God for the people of God.
Well, we are wrapping up our time of considering and praying about and talking specifically about lives of generosity, the way that we grow in generosity, learning that from God. We were in seminary when I really saw it, outside of my family anyway. My husband Brad and I were newlyweds. Our first year of marriage, he was an intern serving a church, and I was commuting an hour and a half to school, finishing up seminary at Duke in North Carolina. We lived in the vicarage, which is the house that the vicar lives in, and my husband was the vicar. Isn't that cute? And the house in the vicarage where we were, they had permanently set up a sump pump in the basement. You know what that means. And they had temporarily strung a wire across from coming out the window of the church office and going between that and our house and into the window of our house so that we had internet. So that was nice. And if we didn't keep up with bleaching the bathroom floor really regularly, then mushrooms would sprout out between the tiles. It was great. You know, in the first year of marriage, who cares? We had a place to live, and we had $900 a month to live on. And I watched again and again as we had what we needed, everything that we needed. I learned about God's provision in those years, about manna in the wilderness. I learned that from our circumstances. But I learned generosity from the people, from others during that time, and especially from the farm community in Nebraska where Brad grew up. The population of that town was 300 people. The membership in the Lutheran church was 350. I thought that was great. It must be preacher counting, right? They were Germans, and they were farmers. And they believed that God had uniquely gifted this church to raise up and to send out pastors for the church. So they were farming more than just corn. These were people who knew in their bones about God's provision. They knew what it was to depend on God to feed and to water those crops that were their livelihood. They certainly knew what it was in some years to stand in the window in the evening during a hailstorm and to watch that crop go to ruin and to wonder if they would make it through. And yet, each year that Brad was in seminary, this is going to well up in me. Each year, a check for $10,000 would arrive from this community of the faithful just for us. $10,000 to help him pay for seminary. $10,000 from the people who did not know what the year would hold for them, what the spring weather would be like, but who knew that God had been faithful and who wanted to be faithful in response. Generosity comes naturally to some people. Some people seem to have a natural inkling toward it, as though they started giving themselves away at birth. I think the Bible was written for the rest of us, though. The rest of us have to be schooled at generosity. We have to learn it in one way or another. For some of us, like Brad and I, we learn it by being the beneficiaries of the selflessness of others. Having others take care of you, and then realizing that it really wasn't about you. It wasn't that you were so special or unique. It was simply the way that that person or those people live. It was all because of them. I know so many of you have incredible stories to share about the people who have shared with you, the people from whom you have received and learned and through whom you have grown. Who is that for you? Who showed you this? Some of us learn to give because we've been first on the receiving end. We've learned about the generosity of God by watching in real time the generosity of other people, and in them we have seen God. Perhaps that's what the church is, or what the church is meant to be. Among other things, it can be a school for generosity, a lab where we get to watch others carry out lives that are driven by gratitude and are lived in faithful response to this generous God. We get to see the people about whom these Proverbs that we read speak, those who give so freely and yet seem to grow all the richer because of it. Those who flourish like green leaves. If that's right, if the church is meant to be a school, an apprenticeship in generous, faithful living where we can watch others flourish and see the movements of one generous life after another, friends, then I would say that in that group of schools, of churches, First Church surely must be among the Ivy League. This is a church where I believe that one of our greatest strengths is the ability we have to have a front row seat, to watch and to learn from and to be loved by some of the most generous spirits that I have ever known. Take, for example, Burt Jones. When I first arrived at First Church, the number of people who referred to Burt Jones as a model and as someone who directly impacted their faith life, that number of people was so great that I didn't realize he had already died, much less that he had died 15 years before. His presence was still so greatly with us and is even today. At the end of this week, here just a couple of days ago, I had a few guys sit down and share a little bit with me so that I could share with you about Burt. I'll warn you, this is not the cleanest edited video that you've ever seen, so I hope you'll forgive that. But what these guys have to say is so important. Take a listen to what Tom Watkins, Gordon Wesley, and Tom Osley all said about Burt Jones.
Well, I became crazy about Burt Jones the first time I met him, which was at a seminar that we had Sunday night here at the church, and that was the first time I met him. And he introduced himself as a person who was coming to the twilight of a mediocre military career. And having been raised in a military family, I had never heard a retired military person say anything like that. And I thought, this is going to be fun.
You know, I knew him later in his life. He was, of course, a retired Air Force pilot, been shot down. He was very outgoing, but he was also humble. And
he was a person of absolute integrity and would go way beyond in his giving of himself. I don't think he was the one that gave me the line, but he embodied, the ministry of presence. Burt was present at all the activities of the church, and he had friends that were 10, 12, 15 years old, and he had friends that were in their 80s and all in between, because he showed up, and he was there, and he could help you.
Burt had the most amazing ability to make teenagers feel like he was their best friend. And in every one of those kids, including my son David, that was really the first adult person over 70 who was a close personal friend that they weren't related to. He went all the way to Pennsylvania to go to my son's graduation from college.
You know, I was hanging up, when I first came to the church back in 93, 94, 93, and they had this hands-on housing project that they would do, and I participated that in the spring of 94, and I was hanging upside down on a roof, nailing something up under the eave, and he said, "Oh, looks like you should go on ASP, you know." And I said, "I'd like to, you know," because I'd heard about it. And so I went that year.
But Bert could see things in all of us that sometimes we didn't see in ourselves, and he invited us to try to become those people.
Well, I think I think that's what Bert did with me. Even as he said, "You know, I want you to take this," when he was ready to stop. And you know, my first few years at that, I was, I was on pins and needles. But I grew into that, and we get people involved in it. And now that I've stepped away, you know, other people are stepping up. They've participated.
In terms of generosity, I can remember one time kind of maybe whining a little bit to him that if we could get 10 more people in the church to tithe, or if we had 100 people in the church that tithe, we wouldn't be having these monetary problems that we seem to have year after year in those days. And he looked at me and said, "Tom, you know, the tithe is just the minimum. Surely you're going to do more." And I thought, what a gift. Here I was whining about somebody else, and he could immediately focus on where it ought to be, which is your own decision and not other people's decisions.
When he died, I thought it's going to take 6 of us to be able to touch as many kids as he did. But that example is overwhelming, in which you can't not. And so when our minister says, stand up and shake hands and greet the people around you, I always go to kids, just so that they know that somebody's looking at them and thinking about them and wants to talk to them, which is something I'd have never done before I met Bert Jones.
You hope that you paid attention to what they tried to teach you, and you are able to show that by actions and not just words. Words are very cheap, as we all know, and but actions like many of us have great people in our background, Bert being one of them, help you to remember what you've been given and hope that you'd be faithful to that.
But Bert had it. He was the most generous soul I ever came in contact with. It's a unique and admired talent that I wish more of us had. And I think that because he was so generous of spirit and time, that a lot of us have worked harder at trying to be present and trying to be generous.
So here's the thing. I could have easily found a dozen more people in this church who would tell you that their life was impacted, and even today, 20 years, 40 years later, their life is still shaped by Bert's generous life. And each of those people could also tell you another 5 or 10 people just in this church who have also led them in the way of a generous life, who showed them what it looked like. And then I could find people for those people too, who say, well, but it was Gordon Wesley or Tom Osley or Tom Watkins or you who impacted me. And the generations turn to generations. I heard stories of people who kept this church alive during tough times in the 60s and in the 80s because they had watched the generations before them do it during the Depression and through the war years. And they knew that to keep this church going through tough times meant to make it possible for lives to be changed down the road. Lives that they didn't know, those who hadn't been born yet, those they would never meet. They could not have known, but they trusted God. And they gave of themselves just as others had done for them. The lives of those people who could not keep to themselves, but who poured out and who pour into others. Those generous lives lead to another generation of generous lives. And that one leads to the next and to the next. When we look around this congregation, there are saints among us, friends, are there not? Imperfect people who are giving away their money and their time and their love for the sake of others, even for the sake of those that we don't know and that we won't ever know. And yet each of those people can turn back and can remember the people who taught them, who showed them. We see it again and again and again. One generous life leads to another. Generosity can be learned, friends. For in the end, we've all learned it from God. We've all learned it from the one who gave away his own life so that we could really live and live abundantly. Not abundantly full of stuff that is just for us and not a life that purely just revolves around us, but a life in which blessing is shared and shared and shared again, so that others might come and receive and be blessed and then turn to go and to bless others. With blessing and abundance going around like that, friends, from person to person to person, surely we find that we have enough. Some of you walked in here today for the very first time. You just happened to pick this Sunday to come visit a new church on this October Sunday. I'm so sorry. No, actually, I'm really not. Because perhaps you're the next one. Perhaps you are just aching for a community where this much is shared among us and shared with the world. Maybe this is the thing to restore your faith in the church, to see a gathered people where kids find grandparents that they didn't know they were missing, where we all teach each other, young and old. You know, Burt Jones was so impacted as he grew older and learned more and more about feminism that when he was 75 years old, he hyphenated his last name to include his wife's name. 75. We teach each other, friends, and we grow together as we tell the stories of this marvelous God who has worked in our lives and is at work in the world, inviting us to give ourselves away and to just see what happens. So if you're new, I'm not sorry that you're here today. I'm delighted that you're here today. You remind me of the generations past who knew that one day you would come. And you remind me of the generations to come in the future who one day may be changed even by you. So it is with this spirit that we make our commitments today. And we live them out every day, growing in the generosity and the grace of God, who is, of course, the most generous of all. Amen. Thanks be to God.